Joining me now, who will not be singing, but I think he gets the message, the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. Kevin, I could not believe that statement, and it was intentional, almost poll tested. Would you be surprised if 70 million people were insulted by it?
Oh, being one of those 70 million, I can tell you that we're insulted. And look, we've gone from one of the most successful presidencies in history, just objectively, Brian, doesn't matter where someone is on the political spectrum, to the worst presidency in less than a year and a half. And so I can tell you that people are insulted, they're infuriated by the hyperbole, and they're frankly looking for President Biden to actually be halfway competent.
The other big story, which will remain a big story until we find out the actual verdict, probably at the end of June, will be the impact of overturning Roe v. Wade and the protests that are happening across this country, especially around the homes of the Supreme Court justices, which I personally find totally unacceptable. I say the same thing if pro-lifers were going after liberals in some way, shape, or form. But what impact will that have on the midterms which you see at the Heritage?
Well, let me just hang on your first point real briefly and say it's unconscionable that President Biden did not condemn the proposed violence at the homes of these Supreme Court justices. Like you, I would agree, as all pro-lifers would, that shouldn't happen to any member of the court, even if they disagree with us on pro-life issues. But to your question, I think the electoral impact of this ultimately is going to be a little more helpful to the right than to the left. I know that our radical leftist friends believe that this is going to drive turnout. But what we're seeing qualitatively and quantitatively at Heritage, that is looking at 2 or 3 polls this week, is that Americans realize the agenda on the left regarding abortion isn't merely protecting Roe versus Wade. It's actually allowing partial birth abortions. There's a bill that's been filed in the California Assembly to that point, Brian, that would allow abortions, quote unquote abortions, up to a week after the baby has been born. Right. The more our side can focus on that, I actually think the more this is a net positive electorally for conservatives.
And also, it's not banning abortion. It's letting the states decide, and then you could decide where you live, like you decide about taxes, like you decide about freedom when it comes to masks and everything else. Let's move to the last element. Within the Republican Party, you know all these players. It seems like there seems to be a growing rift between the Bushes and the Trumps. And I'll give you an example. For example, George W. Bush is now going out for Brian Kemp and strong for Brian Kemp in Georgia, as opposed to Perdue for Trump. Of course, Liz Cheney is being primaried in Wyoming. Cheney's and Bushes are tight, and Trump couldn't have more of a rift with Cheney. And then you have a situation where George P. Bush is running for Attorney General against Ken Paxton. They're on opposite sides. Does that concern you as somebody who's a conservative?
Well, it concerns me that there's a rift in our movement because we've got to get busy about the business of taking back this country. What I will say, and be careful not to sound like I'm making an endorsement because that's not the business I'm in, is that when it comes to the conservative movement, Brian, that where this movement is going, if you look at J.D. Vance's win in Ohio this week, is toward a working class conservatism that is hostile to the centralized power in D.C., to the establishment. They want politicians who actually do what they say they were going to do when they're on the campaign trail. That's the business Heritage is in. You know, the different tribes in the party are going to win some and lose some. Ultimately, we're focused on a conservative governing majority that does the business of the people, which is taking back this country.
Last question, real quick. You're stiff-arming big business, going to blue collar. Does that concern you? Reagan embraced big business.
Well, it doesn't concern me, although I love your question, and you're right that Reagan did embrace big business. You know why? Because 40 years ago when he did so, big business loved America. Right now, we have Fortune 10 companies who say, like the big tech companies, they're not even American companies. So I'm happy to stiff-arm anybody who hates this country and embrace the small guys, because it's ultimately the small guys who make this country what it is.
Kevin Roberts, Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much, Kevin.
You got it. Thanks.
Have a great Mother's Day weekend.